She knocked on my door at 7:40 on a Tuesday evening, holding a casserole dish covered in foil, and the first thing she said was, "I made too much itch. You don't have to eat it if you don't want to." I stepped back and let her in. That was 8 months before I understood what she had actually meant. My name is Bennett Hale. I'm 38 years old and I teach high school history at Riverside Academy in Portland, Oregon. I've been at the same school for 11 years, same classroom on the 3rd floor, with the window that faces the courtyard, same coffee mug I've had since my 2nd year. The job suits me. I like the repetition of it, the way the same questions come around every semester dressed in different students, and I like the quiet of an empty classroom in the late afternoon when the overhead lights are off and the last of the daylight is sliding across the desks. I moved into my current apartment 2 years before that Tuesday. My marriage to Karen ended the spring before that. We'd been together 7 years, married for 4 of them, and the ending was not dramatic. There was no single event, no revelation, no final blow. It was more like watching a tide go out very slowly over a very long time, until one morning you look up and the water's just gone, and the sand is exposed, and it's been that way for a while, and you simply hadn't let yourself name it. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table and agreed that we had stopped reaching for each other across a distance we had both helped create, and that we were too honest with each other by then to pretend otherwise. The divorce was civil. We divided the furniture without argument. Karen took the record player. I took the bookshelf. That felt right to both of us. After the divorce, I rented a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building in the Selwood neighborhood, the kind of apartment complex with a small courtyard out front and a community mailbox station and a laundry room in the basement that smells like dryer sheets and something industrial. The building has 8 units, and most of the tenants keep to themselves in that particular way of Portland apartment dwellers. A nod in the hallway, a held elevator door, cordial and clean. I filled the 2nd bedroom with books I hadn't had room for before and a reading chair from a second-hand shop on Division Street, a wide wingback in faded green velvet that had seen a better decade but held me well. My routine was deliberate and not unhappy. I graded papers at the kitchen table most evenings. I walked to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings and bought things I didn't strictly need. Ugly tomatoes and dried herbs and small jars of honey from a beekeeper who came from Hillsborough every week. I started running along the river path in the early mornings before the traffic built up, and I cooked most of my own dinners because cooking demanded enough attention to quiet everything else. There was purpose in all of it. I wasn't drifting, I was just still, and I had decided that still was okay. I met Josie in the laundry room. It was a Sunday in October, the kind of Pacific Northwest Sunday, where the clouds have been sitting in the same position since Thursday, and the light outside is the color of old paper. She was folding shirts on the long counter by the dryers, and she had earbuds in, and she was humming something under her breath that I couldn't identify. I didn't interrupt. I moved my load from the washer to the dryer without making eye contact, which is standard laundry room protocol, and I went back upstairs. The next time I saw her was in the mailbox area. She was wearing paint-stained overalls and holding what appeared to be an actual plant she had just collected from a package. Small clay pot, succulent, roots wrapped in brown paper. She told me it had been shipped from a greenhouse in Arizona, and she had been tracking it for 4 days. I said I didn't know you could ship plants. She said you can ship almost anything if you package it correctly. Then the mail was collected, and she went upstairs and I stood there for another few seconds, feeling like I had missed something but not knowing what. Her name was Josie Albright, and she lived in Unit 6, 2 floors above me. She was a freelance illustrator who worked mostly on children's books and some editorial work for a small press in the Pearl District. She had moved into the building around the same time I had, about 6 months earlier, and she was, I later found out, 34 years old, originally from Boise, moved to Portland after a long relationship ended, and she decided she needed a city that didn't know her as half of something. I know all of this now. At the time, I only knew the plant and the overalls and the earbuds. We started running into each other in the way you do when you share a building and have similarly inconvenient schedules. She was often up early, and I would pass her on the stairs some mornings while she was coming back from what I assumed was a walk, carrying a coffee from the cart 2 blocks east. She held the stairwell door for me once, and I said good morning, and she said I hope it gets there, and it took me a beat before I understood she was making a joke about the weather. And by then, she was already up the next flight. In November, The building's heater had a multi-day outage. The management sent an email, apologized, said a technician was coming Friday. Josie slid a note under my door. It said, "Unit 6 has a space heater. If it gets bad down there, knock." Written in the same careful hand I would later recognize from the labels on every jar in her kitchen cabinet. I didn't knock. I wore 2 sweatshirts and graded a set of essays on the Boston Massacre and went to bed early. But I kept the note on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks before I made myself throw it away. I didn't examine why. In December, she knocked on my door and asked if I had an extra egg. She was making banana bread and had counted wrong. I had 3 eggs and I gave her one, and she thanked me and went back upstairs, and 40 minutes later there was a small bundle at my door, a piece of banana bread wrapped in parchment paper, with a square of masking tape across the top that she had drawn a tiny loaf of bread on with a marker. No name, no message, just the drawing. I ate it over the sink, and it was very good, and I told myself it was neighborly. In January, the building hosted a small tenant gathering in the courtyard. The management set up a folding table with cheap wine and a cheese plate and called it a winter social. Most people came for 10 minutes and left. Josie stood near the table for a while talking to the woman from Unit 2, who I knew only as the one with the large orange cat. I was about to leave when Josie appeared beside me and said she was also trying to leave but couldn't figure out the right moment to do it without it looking deliberate. I said, "If we both start moving toward the door at the same time, it looks like a coincidence." She said, "That's the smartest thing I've heard all week." We walked out together. On the stairs, she stopped 2 steps above me and turned, and from that height she was eye level with me, and she said, "I've been meaning to ask, what do you teach?" "History," she said. "Oh, like all of it?" I said I was working on it. She laughed and went upstairs, and I went downstairs and I stood in my apartment for a minute in the dark before I remembered to turn the lights on. After January, we started talking more. Not formally, not in any way either of us named or organized. It was more like we both stopped pretending that running into each other in the stairwell was a coincidence worth ending quickly. She told me she was illustrating a book about a girl who collects maps of places she's never been. I told her I was trying to finish a unit plan on reconstruction that didn't make my juniors fall asleep. She told me about a farmer's market vendor in Boise who her grandmother used to buy dried lavender from. I told her about the beekeeping guy from Hillsboro, and she wanted to know every detail about the honey operation, how many hives, what flowers were nearest, how he got into it. She asked good questions. That was the thing I noticed first and kept noticing. Not polite questions to fill space, but questions that meant she had actually heard the last thing I said and was following a thread in it. That kind of listening is rarer than most people realize. And then in March she knocked on my door at 7:40 on a Tuesday with that casserole dish. She said she had made a chicken and wild rice bake, and it was too much for one person, and my light was on, and she thought I might be home. I noted that she had specifically come downstairs at 7:40 on a Tuesday to check if my light was on before knocking. I noted it and then set the observation aside without examining it. We sat at my kitchen table and ate the chicken and wild rice bake, and she told me about a revision note she'd gotten from an editor that had made her laugh out loud at her desk. The editor wanted the map in the book to show only places that couldn't be found on Google, and I told her about a student who had written an essay arguing that Abraham Lincoln's greatest achievement was Twitter, meaning he had clearly used AI and run a very unfortunate prompt. She laughed until she had to put her fork down. We cleaned up together, she washed and I dried, and when she left at 10 she paused at the door and said, "This was good." I said it was. She nodded once and went upstairs. Here is what I didn't understand then, but what I was slowly building toward understanding. Josie had been choosing, consistently, quietly, for months. The note under my door during the heater outage, the banana bread with the drawing, the timing of when she came down to the laundry room. She was not making these moves in an obvious way. She was making them in the only way that felt true to who she was, gradually, honestly, leaving small signals that a person would have to be paying attention to receive. I was paying attention. I just hadn't yet decided what to do with what I was receiving. In April, I went to a parent-teacher conference that ran until 7 and came home to find a folded piece of paper wedged into the top of my doorframe. She had drawn a small cup of coffee on it, and underneath it she'd written, "I passed your door twice. Light was off. You good?" I stood in the hallway reading it for longer than was strictly necessary. In May, something shifted, or I suppose it had been shifting the entire time, and I only noticed it in May because that was when it became uncomfortable to keep pretending I hadn't. There was an afternoon I came home from school in a worse mood than I had left in. A situation with a student, a parent email that had mischaracterized something I'd said in class, the kind of professional friction that follows you home and sits with you at dinner. I changed out of my work clothes and made myself a cup of coffee and sat in the green chair and stared at the middle distance for 20 minutes. Then my phone buzzed. It was Josie, she said. I just saw a dog wearing a raincoat outside. It looked extremely dignified. Thought you needed that. I had not told her I was having a hard day. I had not told her much of anything about my day. But she had apparently decided I needed something, which meant she was tracking enough about my general patterns to know when something was off without being told. I sat in that chair and held the phone and thought about what it meant that someone who lived 2 floors up had developed an internal radar for my moods and was quietly, consistently responding to them. I thanked her. I sat with the feeling for a while. I put it somewhere careful and didn't look at it too directly. Then June came and my ex-wife Karen called me. She and I had stayed on civil terms. We exchanged the occasional text, a check-in when one of us heard something about a mutual friend, nothing loaded or complicated. So when she called, I answered without concern. She told me she was in Portland for a work thing, a conference for her firm. She said she was staying at a hotel downtown and asked if I wanted to get coffee, catch up, see how I was doing. We met at a place on Morrison Street on a Saturday morning. It was Karen, the same as always, composed, bright, the kind of person who arrives places already settled. We talked easily, the way people do when they were once genuinely close, and the time has been long enough that the hard parts have softened without disappearing. She asked about the school. I asked about her firm. She ordered oat milk in her coffee and mentioned it with a kind of defensive humor, like she knew how it sounded. After an hour she went quiet in a way I recognized. Karen went quiet the way she did when she was organizing a thought she wasn't sure she should say, and then she said it. She told me she had been thinking about our marriage. She said she had been in therapy for the past year, and she had learned things about herself, about how she had pulled away instead of reaching toward. And she said she wasn't sure she had ever actually given up on us, she had just stopped knowing how to keep going. I listened to all of it. Karen was not being dishonest. She was being exactly as honest as she had always been, which was one of the things I had always valued, and one of the things that made what I was hearing harder to dismiss with a clean conscience. But there was a problem, and I knew it while she was still speaking. Karen had seen Josie exactly once, 6 days before this coffee, when she'd been driving past my building to scout a parking spot for a dinner she was going to nearby. She had texted me that evening and I had answered without knowing what she had just seen. Josie had been on the front steps of the building at that moment, sitting in the late-day sun reading something, and Karen had recognized her as someone she had once met briefly at a building event. She knew Josie lived in my building. She knew I had not mentioned Josie once in any of our check-in texts, and Karen, who had been with me long enough to understand the particular shape of my blind spots, understood exactly what my silence meant. She did not lie to me that morning at the coffee shop. What she did was more precise than lying. She told me truths and arranged them in a way that implied a story that wasn't quite real. She said she had missed me. She said she had been thinking about what we lost. She said she wondered carefully if I had someone in my life. And when I said no, not exactly, she filed that information and returned to what she'd been building. She didn't mention Josie. She didn't need to. What she needed was my attention redirected long enough to create doubt. 3 days after I met Karen for coffee, Josie went quiet. Not coldly, not dramatically. She didn't avoid me or send a message explaining anything. She simply stopped. The small folded notes stopped appearing. The texts with pictures of dignified dogs or interesting plants stopped. When we passed in the stairwell, she smiled and said hello and kept moving. She was not rude. She was not distant in a way that could be named or confronted. She had simply closed something that had been open with no explanation and no sound. I noticed immediately. That was the part that clarified something for me, how immediate it was. Within 2 days I had been moving through my apartment differently, quietly rearranging myself around an absence I hadn't known was a presence until it was gone. I kept teaching. I graded the end-of-year exams. I walked the river path in the mornings and passed the coffee cart and came home and sat in the green chair. But the building felt different, smaller in the wrong ways. My coworker Trent, who teaches AP English 2 rooms down from me, and who had been listening to me not talk about Josie since February, came into my classroom on a Thursday afternoon while I was erasing the board and said, point blank, something happened. You look like you're grading papers at a funeral. I told him about Karen's visit. Trent stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and looked at me for a long time. Then he said, did you tell Karen you weren't seeing anyone? I said, not exactly, he said. Did Josie stop reaching out after Karen's visit? I said, yes, he said. Bennett, come on. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table and thought about it. And the more I thought, the more the shape of it became clear. Karen had come to Portland intentionally. She had not been passing through. She had said enough to introduce doubt, to imply a reconnection that hadn't happened, to make herself large enough in the frame that whoever else was standing near me might reconsider how much space they occupied. I thought about Josie drawing a tiny loaf of bread on a piece of parchment paper. I thought about the note wedged in my doorframe with the coffee cup drawing. I thought about the text with the dog in the raincoat, sent to no one who had asked for it, at exactly the right moment. I thought about how long someone patient is still willing to wait once they decide they've misread the situation. I drove to the farmer's market on Saturday morning and bought 2 jars of the honey from the Hillsborough beekeeper. I walked back to the building. I stood at the bottom of the stairwell for a minute. Then I climbed to the 4th floor and knocked on door 6. Josie opened it. She was wearing paint-stained overalls again, different ones, and she had a small brush tucked behind her ear, and she looked at me with an expression that was careful and open in equal measure. I didn't ease into it. I had rehearsed easing into it on the drive back from the market, and I knew that if I eased into it, I would find a way to say something less than what I meant. I said, Karen came to see me last month. She implied we were reconnecting. We weren't. We had 1 cup of coffee, and I have not reached out to her since, and I don't intend to. She knows about you. Not because I told her about you, but because she figured it out, and I think she came here to create enough interference that you'd step back. I think it worked. And the fact that it worked for 3 weeks without me doing anything about it is the part I should have handled faster. Josie looked at me. She leaned against the doorframe. Behind her, the apartment was full of light. She had the blinds open, and the walls were hung with her own illustrations, framed and unframed, plants in every corner, the small succulent from Arizona on the windowsill. It smelled like the coffee she had clearly been drinking and faintly like turpentine. She said, she told me you still had things you were working through together. I said, we worked through everything 2 years ago when we signed the papers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you know, I knocked on your door that March with a casserole dish because I wanted an excuse that wasn't the actual reason. I said, what was the actual reason? She said, I'd been trying to think of a reason to knock on your door since November. I looked at her. She was not smiling yet. She was holding very still in the way a person holds still when they're deciding whether to trust something they've wanted to believe for a long time. I said, I have been paying attention to everything, the note during the heater outage, the banana bread, the texts, the way you always asked the next question. I am slow at this, not because I don't know what I want, because the last time I was sure about something like this, I watched it go out slowly, and I wasn't paying enough attention to catch it in time. I didn't want to misread this. I wanted to be sure, she said. And I held up one of the honey jars. I said, this is for you from the beekeeper. I've been meaning to bring you one since February. She laughed. One real, full laugh, the kind that comes out before a person can decide how to hold it, and she reached out and took the jar and looked at it the way she had looked at the succulent from Arizona, like she'd been tracking its arrival and was pleased it finally showed up. She opened the door wider and said, come in. I'll make coffee. I did not call Karen. There was nothing to say. The coffee on Morrison Street had been our last conversation, and it would remain that. 3 weeks after I knocked on Josie's door, Trent stopped me in the hallway at school between 2nd and 3rd period and looked at me closely and said, you look like a person again. I said I was working on it. He said, Josie? I said yes. He went back to his classroom shaking his head with the kind of satisfaction that belongs entirely to the person who said, I told you so first. Josie and I didn't name what we were for a while. We didn't have a conversation about it. We didn't need to. By July we were walking to the farmer's market together on Saturday mornings, and she'd come back with things for her kitchen, and I'd come back with unnecessary honey, and we'd spend part of the afternoon cooking whatever the market had yielded and calling it dinner early. By August, she had a mug at my apartment, her own white ceramic with a handle she'd repaired once, with gold-colored epoxy in that Japanese technique, the one where they put the break right in the surface instead of hiding it. She told me the name of the technique once. I have since looked it up at least 4 times because I keep forgetting how to pronounce it. I've stopped being embarrassed about that. She illustrated a new book that fall, a longer one, a middle-grade novel about a boy who maps conversations instead of places. She worked on it most mornings, and would sometimes show me pages in the afternoon, not for feedback exactly, but because she said she worked better when someone else knew what she was making. I sat across from her at her kitchen table while she worked and graded the first batch of fall essays, and we occupied the same silence in a way that felt earned. By October, a year after I first saw her in the laundry room with her earbuds in, I understood something that had been assembling itself for a long time without my full participation. She had not arrived in my life as a resolution. She had not shown up to replace what Karen and I had, or to repair something broken. She had simply been present in the building where I lived, paying attention, consistently and without agenda, and she had shown me through the accumulation of small things that being noticed by someone who expects nothing back is its own category of extraordinary. In November, I found a new note in my door frame. Small, folded once. She had drawn a tiny honey jar on it, and inside the jar she had written 2 words, "Still good?" I walked upstairs and knocked on her door. She opened it and looked at me with the same expression as always, careful and open in equal measure, like someone standing at the edge of a good thing and deciding whether to step into it completely. I said yes, still good. She smiled then, the full version, the one that had been all the way behind the corners for a long time, and she pulled the door open and stepped back, and I walked in. If someone has been quietly washing up for you, in small ways without making a production of it, I hope you're paying attention, and if you've been waiting for the right moment to say something, I'd gently suggest that the right moment has probably already come and gone a few times, and it's waiting for you to catch up. Drop a comment below. Tell me about a time someone showed up for you in a way you almost missed. I read every single one. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs it, and if you're new here, welcome. This is His Quiet Stories. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.